In this lesson, I'm going to walk you through the Blender user interface and how to navigate the viewport and what all these crazy windows are. So as soon as you download Blender, you're met with the famous default cube. This is going to be in the beginning of every Blender scene you start. A lot of people start off by deleting it, the poor guy, but the other objects we have here are a camera and a lamp. You can left click to select those, but this is the beginning of any Blender scene, no matter what you're doing. These objects are going to be in there. Besides this big window in the middle, which we call the 3D viewport, there's a few other things around the outside where you can control other things around rendering, your lighting, for example. You can add materials in this area, but we'll get to all those in a little bit. The biggest area you want to be focused on is this middle area, and that's called the 3D viewport. Now, you may have figured it out already, especially if you have a mouse, but pressing down on your middle mouse button will allow you to spin the view around. And this was the thing that was very exciting for me when I first started using 3D software, was just being able to spin the view around like that. So pressing down on your middle mouse is how you're going to do that. Now, if you do not have a mouse, then what you can do to navigate around the viewport is just in this area up here, you can click and drag, and that will allow you to spin the viewport around. So you might see all these different menus and things up here, but we really don't spend a lot of time in most of them because Blender relies so heavily on hotkeys. And hotkeys are basically just commands on your keyboard that you'd be pressing together, sometimes in combination, to complete a command. And using those hotkeys will help you work a lot faster in Blender. Now, sometimes you want to look in a particular direction. So this is where having a number pad comes in handy. You can press 1 to go into your front view, 3 to go into the side view, and 7 to go into the top view. And again, those are on your number pad. But if you don't have a number pad, same thing up here, you can click on these little buttons and that will take you to those orthographic views. Now, on the screen, you're going to see all sorts of different buttons. This area up here is called the outliner, and that's where Blender is going to basically be keeping track of everything that's in your scene, and kind of when you add new objects, those will all appear here. So you'll see in the scene, we do also have a light, which is this little dot thing. And then this triangle shaped object is our camera. And that's what we use to render our image. If we render an image, it's going to be looking through that perspective. Now, sometimes you might need to change the appearance of your viewport. So you can click and drag on any kind of area here. These are all customizable to be different things. You know, if we really wanted to, we could change them all to be 3D viewports, for example. That's really all these are. They're just different windows within Blender. And another thing to note is if you ever get stuck or you get your interface in a place where you're not feeling comfortable with it, then just press File, New, General, and don't worry about saving it, and you'll be right back to where you started. If you made changes in your preferences, like to the interface scale, that will all be there. So you may have seen me rotating the viewport like this with the middle mouse button, but another thing you might want to do sometimes, like if you want to look in another area, is to pan the viewport. And you can do that without a mouse or a keyboard just by clicking in this area here. This little hand icon will allow you to pan the viewport if you just click and drag. That's particularly useful if you're using a trackpad on a laptop. But the hotkey for that is just going to be holding Shift on your keyboard and then the middle mouse. That will allow you to pan your view around. So that's really helpful when you're moving kind of between objects. But when sometimes you want to be rotating around a specific object, and there's a really handy tool in the preferences that will allow you to do that. And that's one thing that I do recommend changing when you're getting started. So if you go into the preferences up here in the top left, you can change in the navigation options. You can go to orbit around selection, and that will allow you to orbit around what is selected. So if you actually put your finger on the screen and moved around, it would stay right there. And that's really handy when you're moving around in Blender, is using that option. Now, another thing that I like to do when navigating is I want to be zooming into the direction where my mouse is actually located. So rather than just zooming into the middle of the screen, I want to zoom to where my mouse is. Another thing that's handy for jumping around your 3D scenes. So that's another option we can change here in the preferences. And as you might have guessed it, it's the zoom to mouse position. Now you can see when I zoom in and out that it'll go to wherever my mouse is. Those are just a couple things that I think are important to make your life a little bit easier. This button is to look into the camera view. So if we click that, you'll see actually what the camera is seeing. So if we were to render our image, it would be from this exact perspective. And the hotkey for that, if you hover over here, you'll see the shortcut is numpad 0. So if you press 0 on your numpad, that will go into your camera view. And that's really convenient when you're working on your scene and then moving into actually looking through the camera. If you're not interested in learning the hotkeys, most things in Blender can be accessed a number of different ways. Just like with the navigation tools over here, you can also go into the view menu, and then you can look in your viewpoint and see that these are the commands for viewing top, bottom, front, back, right, and left, and it actually has the hotkey listed out there. So if you ever forget it, don't worry, you can just go in the menu and you'll see it there. So we've covered navigating the view in Blender. Once you figure out your way to kind of get around Blender and how to see different sides of your object, you might be interested to start moving, rotating, and scaling objects. And as you might have guessed, there's hotkeys for those things too, as well as commands over here on the sidebar. Now, if you don't see this sidebar, you can press T on your keyboard and that will bring up that sidebar. There's also a little arrow right there that will pop it out. So in here, you can see we have the move command, which will bring up these arrows and allow you to move objects around. The blue axis is the Z axis, the green one is Y, and the red is the X axis. So that's an easy way to move things around using this gizmo. But as you might have guessed, there is a hotkey for that. And the hotkey is G actually. So if you press G, we'll say that that stands for grab. That will allow you to move an object around inside the viewport. So it will just, no matter where your mouse is, if you press G and then move the object around, it will kind of just stick to it until you press G again. Now, if you had your object here and then maybe moved it accidentally, but you didn't want to actually place it over there, rather than left clicking to place it there, you could press G and then just right click and it will cancel that option. And that goes for a lot of things in Blender. If you're in the middle of a command, but then you don't want to go through with it, you can right click and it will cancel that command. So we've covered G to grab. Now, if you do want to move it on specific axes, then you can sort of combine hotkeys. So we're going to press G and X, and that will move it along the X axis. Sometimes that's important if you want to move things, especially in architectural renderings or something like that. You want to be moving at very defined axes. So knowing those hotkeys is handy. So similarly, GY will move it along the Y axis, and you guessed it, GZ is going to help you move up and down. Now moving on from that, the other commands you might want to know to change objects in the viewport would be rotating them. And similarly to moving them, we have a little gizmo here is what this is called. And this will allow us to rotate objects using this sort of little tool that kind of appears right on the object. And you can see in the top left corner, it kind of appears up here if you look while I'm doing it. You'll see exactly how much that's rotating and the exact angle. Now, just like moving, we can rotate objects using a hotkey as well. So R is going to be the hotkey there. You may have guessed that one as well. They're very conveniently named. But if you press R and Z, we'll be rotating on the Z axis, R and X on the X axis, and R and Y will rotate on the Y axis. Now, another thing I haven't mentioned yet, but that you might find useful, sometimes you want to rotate at a specific angle, or, for example, it'd be common that you want to rotate something exactly 90 degrees. And rather than having to eyeball that, there's a way we can do that easily in Blender by holding the Control key. So real quickly, I'm just going to reset the rotation and location of this object by pressing Alt and G, which will, just like G moves an object, Alt and G will reset the location of it, and then Alt and R will reset the rotation, just so that you can see a little bit easier what I'm doing in this next step. So if we press R and Z, for example, and I want to rotate this exactly 90 degrees, you could look in the top left there and try to get it right on the money, but it's a little bit difficult. So if you hold Control, it'll snap to 5-degree increments, and you can make sure you're right at 90 degrees. And that's another thing that goes for a lot of stuff in Blender, is if you're holding Control, it will incrementally move whatever you're adjusting. On the flip side, sometimes you want to do very small movements, and you want to do even smaller than you can move with your mouse. If you hold Shift while you're doing a command, it will sort of make that a more fine-tuned approach. So you can see I'm spinning around multiple times here, and it's going very slowly. So we covered moving, rotating, and then the last thing you might be interested in doing is scaling. And that's just as simple. We're going to press S to do that, and then dragging out will make your object bigger. And then if you press a defined axis like S and then Z, it will flatten it on the Z axis. S and X will extend it on the X axis. and S and Y will extend it on the Y-axis. And those are really some of the basic hotkeys that you need to know. Sometimes, if you're like me, you might accidentally hit the H key and your object will disappear. And you can probably start to imagine what that hotkey might be. It's the hide hotkey. So if your object just goes out of the screen, completely disappears, you might have accidentally pressed H. One way you can get it back is Alt-H, just like we reset the location with Alt-G, we can press Alt-H and that will reset what's hidden. But you'll also see that that actually checked off this little eye marker right here. So if you look up here, that's another way to hide objects. And then lastly, if you wanted to delete an object, like for example, sometimes when I'm getting started, I just want this cube in the middle, you can delete objects by selecting them with left click and then press X to delete them. Now I'll undo that real quick to also show you that if you want to select multiple objects, for example, if you wanted the camera and the lamp, you can hold down Shift and then left click on it, and that will select two objects at once, which then you can press X to delete them. So then now we just have our cube in the scene. So what we just covered was the very fundamentals of moving around the 3D viewport and doing some very basic commands to control objects within your.
Hi, I'm Remington, and I'm an animator at a social media giant in Silicon Valley. I also run Southern Shotty 3D, where I teach you how to use Blender. And today we're going to be going through your first day in Blender. Blender is a powerful 3D application, and it's being used a lot more in the industry, specifically in game industry and also in animations for film. Blender is a great tool if you're interested in pursuing a 3D career. However, like most 3D applications, it can be kind of intimidating the first time you open it. The goal of this course is to get you comfortable in Blender, specifically with the interface, so that you can move on to more advanced courses and get into learning 3D. We'll mostly be focusing on how to navigate in the 3D viewport to get you comfortable moving around in a project. My goal is that by the end of this short course, you will feel confident in beginning your Blender journey. So with that being said, let's get started. This course wasn't intended to be followed step by step, so try not to worry about keeping up with everything I do. Rather, sit back, relax, and absorb in the information as we walk through Blender's interface. If you're having difficulty following along, check out the bottom right shortcuts here. This will display any key that I put in. Next up, I recommend that you have a 3-button mouse to follow along with. If you're serious about 3D, you're going to need a 3-button mouse, as the middle mouse button is used to navigate your viewport heavily. First up, we're going to take a look at the interface and primarily the navigation. So here we have our 3D viewport and our default scene. By default, that scene includes a camera, a cube, and a light. You can go ahead and delete that to start fresh if you like, but we'll just leave those there for now. Our 3D viewport is kind of like our 3D workspace. This is where we can move around and edit our objects. So let's take a look at how we move around in that space. First, we're going to look at how to use the mouse. So if you middle click on the mouse button, it will rotate around whatever you have framed in that scene. If you hold Shift middle, that will allow you to pan left and right in the scene. You can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, or you can hold Control middle mouse button and move up and down to zoom in and out much quicker. Now, if you don't like that, or it's hard for you to use, you can also click this gizmo up here and click and drag, which will allow you to move around the viewport. You'll also notice that these highlight as you click them, and those will snap you into views. So if I click this, that will snap me into the front view. I can tell what view I'm in by looking at the information up here where it says front. If I click here, that'll take me into the top view. And if I click and drag, I can rotate back to where I was before. You can use the numpad to move through these different views as well. Alternatively, if you come up here under the view menu, you can click view, come down here to viewpoint, and change from top, bottom, front, back, right, or left. You can also see the corresponding numpad shortcuts there. I recommend getting familiar with these because that's something you'll do quite often. Up here, if we come to camera and active camera, that'll actually take us into the active camera in the scene so we can view from our camera's point of view. Now, if we click and move around, it won't move the camera. We need to actually move our camera to adjust the camera positioning. Now, before we move along, I'm going to ask you to change a couple things in your preferences that I believe make navigating much more beginner friendly. We're going to come up here to Edit, Preferences, and then we're going to click Key Map. Now, when we click Key Map, we'll have all these options here. We're going to change just a few. We're going to change Select All Toggles. We're going to change Spacebar Action to Search instead of Play. And then we're going to turn on Tab for Pie Menu. Now, if you X out, it'll save those by default.
I going to start by building out the room with a plane. So just Shift A, mesh plane, and then just scale this out. And I kind of want this to be sort of a long hallway I'm looking down into. Now, I kind of just want to create a sort of subtle like reading corner where someone might be hanging out on an afternoon reading a book next to their beautiful lamp that they designed. So before you go too far with any room design, it's a good idea to think about where your camera is actually going to be looking. So I'm going to add in a camera to my scene with Shift A and then camera. And then that will appear right there at the 3D cursor. But what I'm going to do is go into my camera view with 0 on the numpad, or again, there is an option right here to go into our camera view, and then Shift and tilde to use the W, A, S, and D keys to sort of fly back until I think I'm looking at about the distance that I want to be. So I'll leave my camera right about there, and then I'll change my rotation to 90 so it's looking straight ahead, and then just holding Control with these values to make sure that they're snapped to even increments. So with our camera about where we want it, I was also thinking that it might be cool to do this as a vertical scene. So I'm going to switch this from 1920 to 1080 by 1080 to 1920 so that we have just a little bit more of a current feel to this, creating a vertical render. And it will allow us some unique opportunities with the composition and kind of the story we're telling. So this is looking good. Now, one thing we haven't played with too much yet is the focal length. So on the camera, our focal length by default is usually set to 50, but we might consider bringing that up to something longer, like maybe you're looking longer down this hallway. And because I'm a simple person, I usually like to leave that at very simple increments, so I'll just set that to 100. So that looks pretty good. So we'll set that at, we'll just get our camera back to where it was right there. That's looking good. And then let's pull our lamp into the scene. So our lamp, I think we want to be sort of more against the wall, and I'll just rotate that over a little bit. And then our chair, let's pull that back too. Now our chair we have not done all the parenting with yet. So I'm going to, I could either parent them all to this cushion object, or another way to parent objects is with an empty. So I'm going to snap my cursor to the middle of our cushion right there where the origin is, add a empty, and that'll be a cube. And then I can right click and change the size of the empty. And an empty is basically just a null object that you can't see it when you render, but it's good for just kind of controlling things. That's sort of how I use it. So I'm going to select all our chair objects here until they're all selected. And then lastly, select the empty. Remember the lighter orange one is the active object, and press Control P to parent that to the object. Now, instead of having to select all those objects each time I want to move it, I can just select the empty object. So now I can place that in an area I want. Now, one thing we haven't covered yet, I want to just move this along the floor. So rather than having to go into top view and move it, because when you're in top view, it's not going to be moving in the Z axis because that's the axis we're looking down. It's only going to do X and Y. But you can press G and then Shift Z, which will exclude the Z axis. So G, Shift Z, and something like that, I think is going to look pretty good. I want it to be mostly in the center of the scene. Now in my camera view, I kind of want to see this right side wall a little bit. So I'm just going to move this over a little bit, and I'll use my gizmo to make sure I'm moving the right direction. Maybe that can come to something like that, just so that we see that wall. And then maybe our lamp, we don't want to see quite as much of it. So let's move that over. And then similarly, this lamp base is feeling a little tall, so we can press A and then S and Shift Z, just repeating that similar action to make that just a tad smaller. So that's looking good. Maybe we need to pull out just a little bit more. So let's come out like that till we have a nice frame shot. And then let's sort of extend this scene out a little bit more. So I'm going to press E to extrude this out. And then I actually want this to be a corner. So whoops, let's delete just that face. And then we can select these two and extrude them over. And then let's just go ahead and pull this out further. We're not actually going to see that, but that'll just help us get a little bit of context. So right away, I think what I want to do is start lighting this scene, and maybe not adding some materials quite yet, but I want to play a little bit with, where these walls are landing and kind of what the shadows are going to look like. So I'm going to split my view, which you can click up here in the top right and drag over, or you can just, in anywhere we see those two arrows, you can right click and you can do a split. So I'm going to do a vertical split, move that over just until we have something like that. So decide which side you want your rendered view to be on. I typically like to have it on the right side here, but let's have this be our rendered view, and we'll render in cycles. So real quick, I'll go into the rendered view, make sure I'm rendering in cycles, And then I want to be rendering on my GPU, which is not enabled currently. So let's go into our system preferences and change that to optics or CUDA. There's different options. And then now we can see we have our rendered view here. We might want to set a render border with Control B, just so we're not rendering what's outside the frame there. And we have our default very boring world, but I instead want to use the sky texture. So let's add that in. Let's bring the sun maybe up a tad and rotate around just until we've got sort of a nice light coming into our scene. I kind of want it to be casting just right into our chair. Way too bright right now though, so let's bring the strength down quite a bit. And we need to start adding a lot more wall objects in here so that it's not quite so bright. So one thing I'll also do in my render view is always turn off the overlays so I just have a nice unobstructed view of what we're working on. And let's start shaping this out. So for the ceiling, well, let's actually start with some walls over here just so we don't have so much light coming in from the right. So I'm going to create a new object, and that will just be a plane object. And then let's press Tab RX90. I'm doing that rotation in edit mode so that our orientation over here stays 0, 0, 0. Always good, remember to have this be 1 and these be 0 if you can. So I'm going to add in a solidify modifier, and this will be sort of just our walls object. And you can already see we're starting to get some nice shadows there. So I'm going to bring that up till it's sitting just right on my plane. And then I might move this edge over. And then maybe this is kind of like a multiple window corridor. So let's select this whole object, duplicate this over. And we're getting a lot of light kind of coming in from behind our scene. So even if it's behind the camera, sometimes it's a good idea to actually extend your scene so that, you know, whatever light might be coming in from your world texture is not visible to the light coming in. So now it's a little bit darker in the foreground like you might expect. Maybe you're walking down a hallway and you've got sort of the light shining through these windows on the end. Now similarly, I'd like to add in a ceiling here. So let's just select our floor object. Maybe we'll just take this plane, and then I'm going to duplicate it with Shift D and move that up. And I'm actually going to want this to be its own object. So I'm going to press P again to separate, and separate that by selection. And let's move our origin. So right now the origin is sort of in the same place that it was on the floor object, but let's right click and set our origin to geometry. And that'll just place it where the center of the geometry for that object is. Okay, cool. So that's looking like a nicely framed shot. Now, one other fun thing I wanted to do in this scene was to add a picture on the wall. And there's a really easy way that we could do that. And that's by just importing an image of the picture you want to use, and then we can sort of build a frame around it. So I want to find where about I want to put that picture. And I think it's going to be sort of just in the middle of this wall here. So I'm going to select that wall, Shift S, cursor to selected. And then what I can do is add in an image. Now we actually need an add-on for this. So if you press Shift A, you will see that there's an image option. We have reference and background image, which is very useful to use sometimes, but I want to add an image and have it sort of automatically be in the scene with a texture on it. So there's an add-on that actually comes with Blender called the Import Images as Planes add-on. And if you search for that, it's installed by default. You don't have to download it or anything. Then you'll have a new option where you can do just that. So I'll press Shift A, add an image, and that'll be the images as planes. And then I'll just select an art piece that I've selected here. This is one that I totally painted on my own, didn't create with AI at all, but you might have some art you made on your own, but this is one that I generated using a popular AI image generation service. Really cool, especially for 3D scenes, to start getting some art on your walls. So that's looking good, something like that. Once your scene starts to get complicated, you kind of want to be moving around things really quickly. There's a really good hotkey for that, and it's period on your number pad will frame selected. Okay, so in this lesson, we added quite a few more details to our scene. We, of course, built out the wall. We added a little bit of lighting so that we could see what kind of shadows we were working with. We added a table, we added some shelves, and some other little floorboard details. And we even added a picture onto our wall using the import images as a planes add-on to just start bringing a little bit more personality and life into our scene.